Beruchim haboim. Welcome everyone. We're about to begin Be'ezras Hashem together on Daf Mem Vav Amud Beis at the very top. On the previous Amud, the Gemara had brought two statements of Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. The first one being that the halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. For in our Mishnah, he says when a person is sleeping on the onset of Shabbos or Yontif, he nonetheless is kind of shvisa. He gets 2,000 amos in each direction. A second statement that Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi made was that the halacha is kedivrei hamekil be'eruvin. Asked the Gemara, why do we need both statements? To which the Gemara answered that if we only had the first statement, the halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, I might think bein lahakil, bein lahachmir. Kamash malon, he makes the second statement. The halacha is kedivrei hamekil be'eruvin. If that's so, why not we just teach the second statement? The halacha is divrei hamekil be'eruvin, and that should be sufficient? No. Says the Gemara, because if I only had that statement, I might think, when is that true? When a yachid argues on another yachid. But when the yachid argues on the rabbim, no. Kamash malan halacha ki Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, who's arguing on the chacham in our Mishnah. The Gemara now brings alternative ways of explaining these two statements of Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. Says the Gemara, Rav Papa Omar Itztrich. Rav Papa says we do need both statements. Because, Salke Daitechamino, if I only had the statement that the halacha is Kedivra Hamekil Be'eruvin, I might think to say, Hani Mili Be'eruve Chatzerois. Ava Be'eruve Techumin, Emoloi. When are we Mekel Be'eruvin? In regards to Eruve Chatzerois. But in regards to Eruve Techumin, not. Tzricha, and therefore we need the statement halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, which is discussing eruv techumin. Where do we know to say that there's a distinction between the two types of eruvin, in that we might think to be mekel in eruv chatzeros and not to be mekel in eruv techumin? This nan states in the following Mishnah: Omar Rabbi Yehuda, Ba'med divar mamurim. When is it so that a person can go ahead and make an eruv, and he can only do so if it's with the knowledge of the one who's making the eruv for? That's be'eruv techumin. When you're going to then make eruv techumin, then you must have the consent of the one that you're making eruv techumin on his behalf. Aval be'eruv chatzeros ma'arvin bein ladaz bein shel ladaz. But when it comes to eruv chatzeros, you don't need his consent. Why? Shezachin la'adam sheloi befanav ve'in chavin la'adam ella befanav. We have the principle when a person wants to act on behalf of somebody else as an agent, then it must be that he has to be appointed by that person to be his shaliach, to be his agent. Then when he does something on his behalf, he'll then be on the behalf of that person he's doing it for. However, if he doesn't know about it, then when can he then act on his behalf, and when it's going to be a complete zechus? In other words, it will only benefit the person that he's doing on behalf of. Then we say zachin la'adam sheloi befanav, even without his knowledge. But if there's going to be any disadvantage to the person you're doing it for, then we will say that choiv will make it so that you need to have his consent, otherwise it's not going to be effective. So too over here, when it comes to eruv chatzeros, it's objectively going to be for the advantage, the benefit of the one you're then acting on behalf of, whereby you don't need his knowledge. Even if it's not going to be with him knowing about it, we say zachin la'adam shelo b'fanav. You can make eruv chatzeros on his behalf. But when it comes to eruv techumin, maybe the owner wants to go to the east, and you're making eruv techumin to the west. So therefore, it'll be a disadvantage to him. It'll be a choiv. And therefore, you need his consent in order to make his eruv techumin for him. So therefore, I might think, if when it comes to then the principle that Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi made, that the halacha is gedivrei hamekil be'eruvin, I might think eruv chatzeros and not eruv techumin. Kamash malon halacha kedivrei Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, which is discussing eruv techumin. Rav Ashi Omar Itztrich. Rav Ashi has another alternative way of explaining why we need both statements of Yoshua ben Levi. Salke Daitechamino. I might think to say, Hani mili b'shiurei eruv. When is it true that we say that the halacha is gedivrei hamekel be'eruvin in regards to shiurei eruv. That means that when a person first sets up an eruv of, let's say, 2 su'udos, for many Shabbosos, they're so slowly being eaten and becoming more minimal. And at a certain point, they're very small. There's not even 2 sudos left. So we say that's sufficient. It's still a valid eruv. That's shi'urei eruv. Ava betchilas eruv emoloi. But in the beginning of the eruv, you need to have a full 2 sudos, and therefore we might not be mekil. And since our case is talking about the tchilas eruv, therefore I think the statement of Shimon Levi that the halach is a divrei hamekil be'eruvin only applies to shi'urei eruv, but not tchilas eruv. Kamash Malan, he says halach is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, and therefore he's discussing tchilas eruv. Uminotem ra deshani lon ben shi'urei eruv l'tchilas eruv. Where do I know to say there's a distinction between shi'urei eruv, that which is left over, and tchilas eruv, that which is a new eruv, that we would think to be mekel only on shi'urei eruv and not tchilas eruv. This nan, it says in the following Mishnah, Omer Rabbi Yosi b'amed devar mamurim. When is it true that by eruvei chatzeros that we're going ahead and going to be mekel b'tchilas eruv? Aval b'shi'urei eruv afilu koshu. Only in the very beginning you need to have a full 2 sudos. But as time goes on and the eruv is being eaten, it'll be sufficient and still valid, even if it's just a koshu, a little bit left. The only reason why they required this for the eruv chatzeros is so that the concept of the eruv chatzeros should not be forgotten by the tinokos in future generations, and therefore, after the initial 2 su'udos, even a minimum can be left over to make valid the eruv chatzeros. Says the Gemara Vayter, once we're discussing principles of halacha, now let's discuss further ways of determining halacha. Rabbi Yaakov, Rabbi Zriko, Amru, they said, halacha ke Rabbi Akiva mechaveroi. We have a principle when Rabbi Akiva is arguing on another Tana, so the halacha is Rabbi Akiva. Uk Rabbi Yosi mechaverov. And when Rabbi Yosi is arguing on more than one Tana, the halacha is Rabbi Yosi. Uk Rabbi mechavero. And when Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, is arguing on another Tana, the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. L'may hilchasa. Ask the Gemara, in what respect are we saying the halacha is like either Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yosi, or Rabbi Asi Omar halacha? In regards to the halacha, that means that the definitive publicized halacha, then we can say that's what we're referring to, that the halacha is like Rabbi Akiva or Rabbi Yosi or Rabbi in this case. Rabbi Chia bar Abba Amar Mati. No, not like the halacha, you can publicize it, but rather it's going to be that we sway towards the principle, whereby in an individual case we can then go ahead and say the halacha is like him, but we cannot publicize it. Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Chanina Omar Nirin. No, it doesn't mean you cannot publicize it, you cannot even make it a definitive halacha even for an individual. Rather, it appears like this, whereby it has to be scrutinized and still analyzed. Omer Rabbi Yaakov, in further ways of discussing halacha, says the Gemara, Omer Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi, Omer Rabbi Yochanan. How do we determine halacha? As follows, we have the following rules. Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, Laki Rabbi Yehuda. When you have a machlokes between these 2 great sages, these 2 great tanoim, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir, the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yosi, halakha Rabbi Yosi. When we have a machlokes in Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yosi, the halakha is Rabbi Yosi. Ve'ein tzarich loymar Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yosi. We do not have to say that when there's a machlokes Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yosi that the halacha is like Rabbi Yosi, because hashta b'makom Rabbi Yehuda lesa. When there's a machlokes in Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir, still there's no opinion like Rabbi Meir. We say the halacha is Rabbi Yehuda. Then certainly when Rabbi Meir is going to argue on Rabbi Yosi, certainly the halacha will be like Rabbi Yosi. But Makom Rabbi Yosi be boy, certainly we not need to even mention, because again, when Rabbi Yehuda is arguing on Rabbi Meir, the halacha is Rabbi Yehuda, and when Rabbi Yehuda is arguing on Rabbi Yosi, the halacha is Rabbi Yosi, then certainly the halacha is going to be like Rabbi Yossi if he were to argue on Rabbi Meir. Omar Rav Asi, af ani loimed. I also learn Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shimon halakha Rabbi Yossi. I also learned that when Rabbi Yossi is arguing, in this case with Rabbi Shimon, the halakha would be like Rabbi Yossi. I can say the same principle. The Omar Rabbi Abba, Omar Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, halakha Rabbi Yehuda. When Rabbi Yehuda is arguing Rabbi Shimon, the halakha is Rabbi Yehuda. So if the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda, when Rabbi Yehuda is arguing Rabbi Shimon, then certainly when Rabbi Yossi is arguing on Rabbi Shimon, the halakha would be like Rabbi Yossi, because Rabbi Yossi, who argues on the Rabbi Yehuda, we say the halakha is Rabbi Yossi. So certainly then, when we argue on Rabbi Shimon, the halakha would be like Rabbi Yossi. Hashem Makam Rabbi Yehuda Lessa. Now in a situation when Rabbi Yehuda would be arguing on Rabbi Shimon, the halakha would be like Rabbi Yehuda. Then, B'makam Rabbi Yossi, boy, do we have to mention Rabbi Yossi? Certainly not. Certainly the halakha is like Rabbi Yossi. The Gemara asked the following question in regards to then Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Shimon. We discussed when Rabbi Yehuda is arguing on Rabbi Meir, the halakha is like Rabbi Yehuda. We discussed when Rabbi Yehuda is arguing Rabbi Shimon, the halakha is like Rabbi Yehuda. We also discussed in terms of Rabbi Yossi, the halakha is like him. But what about when Rabbi Shimon is arguing with Rabbi Meir? Who is the halacha like? Answers the Gemara, Teiku. It's a standing question. We don't have an answer whether halacha is like either one or the other.